I was standing on the banks of the Rio Grande, on the Texas side of our watery border with Mexico. I could see Mexico just a wide river's breadth away. It was so hot. We had walked from the town where we had worshipped, where Spanish-speaking U.S. citizens lived in a community without basic utilities, and where they came to the church for the air conditioning as much as spiritual inspiration and consolation. A border agent's SUV came down the dusty road and pulled up, telling our group that even though we were U.S. citizens and even though most of us were white, we had to leave. We were a bunch of seminarians and high schoolers with Youth in Mission, a program of the ELCA that leads immersion learning trips for youth. We couldn't be there in that part of the U.S., even though it should have been perfectly legal for us to stand there looking at the water. As we walked around in the heat of the borderlands and pondered the baptismal waters of the Rio Grande, I came to know the truth of something I'd suspected, that no one would risk this heat, the danger of getting caught, the danger of death by the cartels that smuggle drugs and humans across the border, unless they absolutely had to. The next year, I moved to New York City for my internship in a congregation that drew members from luxury apartments and from the projects, in a congregation where the languages spoken included Tigrinya, Spanish, German, and English. Every Sunday, we held 3 services, a children's service in English in the morning, and then 2 more standard liturgies, one in English and one in Spanish. When I preached, I needed to prepare 3 different sermons. Among our Spanish speakers were Puerto Ricans, Americans, and immigrants from Latin America, both documented and undocumented. Early on in my internship, I suggested, in my baby pastor naivete and always brimming with what I thought were helpful, good ideas, that we should have a cooking and baking class, since I noticed that often the people who I knew were struggling the most financially would bring store-bought prepared food rather than homemade things to our potlucks and coffee hours. I knew that homemade food was cheaper, ultimately, and more nutritious than store-bought food. And my supervisor just looked at me and said quietly, "I don't think it's because they don't know how." And she left it at that. A few days later, I went to visit Beatriz and Samuel, people who had fled violence and threats in Mexico and come to New York to seek a safer life for their 2 teenage children. I've changed their names for privacy. They invited me into their apartment, and I quickly realized that it was a single room with 1 twin-sized bunk bed for 4 adult-sized people. It was very tidy. There was a hot plate and a microwave, and they were lucky to have their own bathroom and not have to share with 20 other people on the hall. I knew that Beatriz and Samuel were both educated and had been professionals in Mexico, but that now they were working in the back of house in restaurants and cleaning. I suddenly realized 2 things. They both probably knew full well how to cook, but didn't have a place to do it. And they had given up so much and risked the very same hot, dangerous crossing I had witnessed the year before, because somehow this life was better than what they had left behind. I had seen poverty before, and I had lived in an impoverished Nicaraguan community in Costa Rica. The people there often put up with dirt floors until they could save enough money to put down tile, and built their houses in parts as they were able to get enough money. But pretty much everyone had a propane stovetop and access to fresh fruits and vegetables. What I saw in New York was a different kind of poverty, one hidden from view inside of apartment buildings divided up for maximum profit. This truth was hard to take in, even though it was right in front of me. Later in the year, when Beatriz's father was dying, she could not go home to be with him and the rest of her family as he died because she could not travel. Even if I thought I kind of understood, I didn't know until I was standing in the midst of it, imagining what it would be like to have to leave behind a home and a family and a life that I loved because my own life depended on it. Not just for some vague notion of a better life, but for survival. When Jesus spoke the truth to the people who were gathered in the synagogue in Nazareth, they were first amazed, wondering if this was indeed the son of the carpenter who was able to speak so articulately, this man who was once a little boy they had all known. And then they were angry. They weren't expecting him to be a prophet. But something that we might not get right away, something Jesus' audience that day would have understood immediately, was that when he lifted up the stories of the widow of Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, he was beginning to proclaim that this good news was not just for people like them, but for foreigners, for outcasts, for everyone they had put on the outside of their community, as well as for them. The easiest way to create community is to create an other. It's not a good way, it's not a faithful way, but it's easy and it's efficient. Whether the other is an immigrant, a person who is trans or gay, or simply someone who doesn't immediately agree with you, the existence of an other allows a group to say, we're not like them, we're the good ones. And when a group's identity is based only on what it's against, it's hard to tell what it's actually for, especially when the fight stops being relevant. Often groups relying on this strategy will simply look for a new enemy to energize their group, but it's not healthy. And it doesn't lead to healthy or enduring community. That instinct is powerful, though. It's so powerful that even Jesus, who had just been praised by everyone in the synagogue for first saying what they wanted to hear, was run out of the synagogue and nearly thrown off of a cliff to his death by a crowd enraged that he would declare that God's promise could and would also extend to those who were not part of their in-group, not part of the covenant of Abraham. As they chased him out, they were proclaiming, but we're the good ones and they're the bad ones. How dare you? Our human instinct is to exclude, but throughout the entire Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, we are commanded to love the people who don't look like us. There are over 2,000 verses in which God and the prophets command us to welcome the stranger, that hospitality is one of the highest virtues. And it's hard to hear in a climate in which we are constantly goaded to hate our neighbor. Like Beatrice and Samuel, our siblings in the queer community have known that they cannot continue to live in what looks like a pretty life if they cannot live a full life. Sometimes they've had to travel a dangerous path. Sometimes it has meant giving up family or home or livelihood in order to be free. Sometimes, if they are very lucky, they have been able to live fully without losing parts of themselves. But always, they have known that living free would come with risk, but that they were choosing between death and survival. Every day in the waters of the Rio Grande, our siblings, made in God's image, risk death to be born again into a new life here in the U.S. Every day, our queer siblings, made in God's image, risk everything to live the full lives God intends for them. Right now, we are overwhelmingly hearing messages that tell us to create community at the expense of the other. But God did not create us to be divided. God created us to live with one another in love, and Jesus calls us to look to the other and see the face of God. When Jesus spoke to the people assembled in the synagogue, he was exemplifying the love God calls us to. He knew, as he stood up in front of these people who had known him since early childhood, that he would use his prophetic voice to call them into a greater love than they had ever thought possible. But in that moment, he also knew that God was with him, and that God's own gospel was in his mouth as he spoke. Love is patient and kind, Paul writes. Love does not boast or rejoice in wrongdoing. Love is a commitment to the dignity of the other, even in moments when we're not sure how we feel about them, even when some part of us fails to recognize the humanity of the other. Love never ends. And when it comes down to it, faith, hope, and love are all important and interconnected, but the greatest and the hardest of these is love. Jesus knew that truth as he stood up in the synagogue. He knew that the truth of God's love and calling would cost him his life, and he stood up anyway. We have been named, claimed, and called into love by the one who created us. How will we live into God's abiding love and into our own baptismal call as Christians? That is the question we most need to ask in these days as we look with love to our siblings the world would cast out and see the face of God in them. Amen.